Frank Stone is the overwhelming threat that the citizens of Cedar Hills will have to overcome during the events of the game The Casting of Frank Stone. Forged in the fires of the town's failing steel mill, Stone would be led onto his path of cruelty by a woman named Augustine Liber, a path that would ultimately see him being reborn as an undying abomination, rabidly killing all whom he encounters in an attempt to please his new god, the Entity. The story of Frank Stone as we know it begins with his birth in 1927 to a less than typical family. While we don't have a great many details about his childhood, Stone, or rather Franklin Norman, his birth name, would be raised in an environment that sought keen to isolate the young man from his peers. Key figures in his life, such as his grandmother, would embolden a sense of self-importance within Franklin from a young age, telling him that the world was filled with vapid, boring simpletons who wanted nothing more than to suck away his time with their desperate need for attention. For Franklin, these stories would ring true. His desire to create meaningful relationships with those around him constantly being undermined by their failure to see that he was a man of great significance. These issues would plague him into his adulthood, and at the age of 29, he would lash out by committing an assault and robbery, garnering a criminal record, as well as getting him locked away as a danger to society. While incarcerated, his violent tendencies would find no quarter. He would continue to lash out at orderlies who failed to see his worth, the brutality marking him as a pariah and constituting that he received some sort of therapy to hopefully quell his bloodlust. Instead, surprisingly in these sessions, he would find validation.
I hear you've had a bad week since our last conversation, Frank. An attack on an orderly. Perhaps we could salvage this. Tell me.
Through his court-ordered therapy sessions, Franklin would meet a woman named Augustine Liber, who would take an unusual interest in her new patient. During their conversations, she would play to his sense of self-importance, using his already aggrandized ego to suggest that he could find his calling in service to a higher power, that he could become eternal if only he would follow the path of the righteous. With examples such as the slaying of Humbaba in the Epic of Gilgamesh, she would show him that violence could be virtuous, that sometimes the sin of man was so great that the gods themselves smile at its cleansing. Locked away from the world, Franklin would learn these despicable lessons, sinking further into himself as Augustine prepared him for some sort of journey, a path to become a champion against the wicked shadows of the forest. However, before he could become divine, a test was required. Evil had been bred into the small town of Cedar Hills, and Augustine needed to be sure that he was capable of snuffing it out. She would arrange for Franklin Norman to get the clearances for a work release program at the town's local steel mill, changing his name to Frank Stone so as to separate him from his criminal history. At the time, the mill had been on its last legs. Waning finances and skeleton crews were barely keeping it afloat, so despite his questionable past, they were open for the labor. A decision they would come to regret, as shortly after his arrival, the killings would begin. By November of 1962, Stone had taken 5 lives to gain the favor of Liber's spiteful god. However, while he had proven himself a devoted slayer of the wicked, in the back of his mind, his conscience had begun to eat away at him. In some of the victims, he could see the sin written plainly across their face, but in others, he saw nothing. No evil to speak of in their cold expressions. To make matters worse, after carrying out the crimes, Augustine had gone silent, leaving him in the hazy fog of the forest, uncertainty gripping as he would ponder his next move. Fortunately for Frank, his guide wouldn't stay silent forever, and in January of 1963, she would come back in praise of his efforts at upending the deep-rooted corruption. He was truly on his way to becoming her champion, but before he would be graced with divinity, 4 more names had to be taken. 4 more roots connected to the evil of this town, and so he would get to work. Using the mill as his base of operations, Frank would take advantage of the limited security and staff to house his sick mission, taking trophies of his victims as he stuck to the shadows, keeping a low profile and never drawing attention to what he was doing behind the rust of the facility. This unassuming facade would work well for the killer until he would abduct an infant from the local community, Augustine calling for the child's death as one of his final trials, a trial he would have passed if not for the involvement of one of Cedar Hills' most dedicated officers. Sam Green of the Cedar Hills PD had come to the steel mill hoping to find a lead on the town's missing infant, his search driving him into the facility's furnace room and into a confrontation with Stone, which would wind up with the killer dead at the bottom of a flaming pit. Stone's reign of terror had been brought to an end, and as the town of Cedar Hills attempted to pick up the pieces of this tragedy and move on, Augustine would begin to make plans for his resurrection. With the power of her god, the Entity, she would set the pieces into motion that would allow for Frank to be reborn. His essence had been seared into the very foundation of the mill, and in its wake, she would devise a strategy to draw it out. Using power derived from the Entity, she would create a camera, selling it to a group of local teenagers who were filming a low-budget movie at the site of his death. Her plan would work flawlessly, the group of teens bringing forth the tortured specter of Stone from beyond the veil, but despite the reincarnation, another issue would rear its head. Sam Green would once again take up the fight against his nemesis, battling Frank with the power of the camera, and in the end, he would be victorious, locking the villain away inside the reels of the film and breaking that film into pieces so that it may never again see the light of day, confining the demon for eternity. However, despite these attempts, Augustine would continue to push forward. Throughout time and the multiverse itself, one by one, she would track down the reels of film that entombed her champion, eventually managing to make good on her promises by bringing Frank Stone back to life, an unkillable machine destined for never-ending slaughter. Frank Stone is the most imposing threat that you'll encounter in the desolate tunnels of the Cedar Hills steel mill. Born to a family that saw him as destined for greatness, he would prove them correct in the most detestable way imaginable. Forged in Augustine's fire with the promises of valor and purpose, he would become a thing of nightmares in his quest for divinity. And while, in the beginning, he would struggle with the morality of his dark, depraved acts, through his new god, he would find that the heavens will not open for a champion who shows restraint.
An endless hunt of fear and hope, pain and sacrifice, from which even death is no escape. And now, let the trial begin.